It's absolutely surreal to have a job that you get to make things up and then you get paid for that. So that part never actually stops being surreal. It stays that way. I love this job for women specifically because so many authors that I know, very few of them come out of college and do this job. They usually have some other career first. In my case, it was software developer. A lot of the women are taking care of their children. A lot of them are homeschooling while they do this quote full-time job, which they couldn't do any other job like that. Or they're taking care of their elderly parents or things like that. So it's a lot of freedom. I think it's a beautiful thing if you are called to write stories.
Let me tell you a story about the hardest job I ever had. I was working as a professor, and the dean came to me and asked me if I would take on the role of festival coordinator for this enormous event the college had every year. I accepted, and I found myself over my head pretty quickly because I discovered the hours required to plan this festival were far more than I was being compensated for. I was given only a few hours a week with an assistant and an intern. I needed a lot of help, but this was not enough. The job was way more than I bargained for, and all the previous notes and plans from prior years were jumbled in a literal mess of stacks of papers and disorganized supplies. It was so daunting. But I slowly pieced it together. I had no choice. It was all on me. In the end, I did it, and it turned out amazing, and I was super proud of myself. But I decided the day of the festival that was the last time I was ever going to do this job. It was a full-time job, essentially, for someone, but not for me, because I was only being paid for a very part-time job. And it was the first time I had an experience with being tasked with doing much more than I was being paid to do. And I know people complain about this. I'm not complaining because it was an amazing experience, and I'm glad that I went through it. But because I wanted to maintain my reputation and my integrity, I made the choice in that situation to go the extra mile, to do my very best, to make it something that I could be proud of, and to have the end result match my personal standards. I knew that I was learning, and that was worth something to me. But at the same time, I was never going to do that kind of a job for less than I was worth ever again. The experience really helped me to shine a light on my self-worth. During this experience, I was also the most stressed that I have ever been in my entire life. It was the first time I felt physical signs of stress. I was so stressed out that I actually forgot the birthday of the person closest to me in my life. I completely forgot it, blanked out, and that was a wake-up call. It was scary, actually. I was never going to put myself in a situation like that again where my mental and physical health was at risk for a job. But I learned a tremendous amount about what it takes to put on a stellar event, a massive event for thousands of people. And that's why the event that I'm planning this year, the Rich Thinking Conference in Philadelphia on September 6th, is such a piece of cake. It's a one-day event that will blow your mind because of the level of the speakers that we are bringing in for you and the people that are going to be in that room for inspiration, for networking, for transformation. This is something that you have to experience to understand the impact. It's like a mastermind on steroids concentrated into one day. I know how to put on a great event. I've done many, and I know how to bring in people who can literally change your life with their words. Words have the power to do that. And that's what you'll get at the Rich Thinking Conference this September 6th in Philadelphia. You can get your tickets at richthinking.org. And we've made it affordable. It is all about you for the day. We want to make it accessible for everyone. Am I getting paid for this? No. In fact, my partner Renee and I are going to end up paying to hold this event. Why are we doing that? Because it's an investment. It's an investment in you, and it's an investment in the world. And it's an investment in us and what we want to do and the impact we want to have in the world. It's like the compound effect that improving individual lives has on the greater society. So just like I did with the arts festival that I planned for the college, I'm putting my best into this. But this time, it's because I want to do it. Because I know that doing things like this makes a difference in the world. And you need to be there in order to get in on this. It's a high vibe, and I want you to ride it with me because I want to surround myself with people that get it, and I know that you get it. So check out richthinking.org to get your tickets, and stay tuned for my fantastic conversation today on blessings.
Welcome back, my friends. Have you ever enjoyed a spicy romance novel? The kind you want to read in a bubble bath sprinkled with rose petals by candlelight? Today's guest, Skye Warren, writes those books. She writes dangerous romance novels for a living, and she never seems to run out of stories. Inside Skye's brain sounds like a very fun place to be, and we're going to hear all about the world of Skye the writer, but we will also hear about Skye the person, the mom and the wife who lives with chronic illness. When your livelihood requires you to exert a certain amount of energy, both mental and physical, under the constant pressure of churning out new full-length novels on a regular basis to keep the business running, it's all down to you. And we'll talk about how being intentional with time and energy to work smarter and not harder is crucial to her perseverance and her success as a New York Times bestselling author and in all of her life's endeavors. She's really cool, and I'm excited to see where this goes. Welcome to Blessings, Skye.
Oh, hi, Mitzi. Thank you so much. That was such an incredible introduction. I'm so happy to be here, and it's such a peaceful, calm place, and I'm looking forward to our chat.
Me too. All right, so let's start out with kind of a deep question, and then we'll go back and set the stage to bring us through your life. So I wanted to know if you could tell us about the moment that you found out or realized or had an epiphany or however it happened that you could write steamy romance novels and make a great living doing it.
Oh, gosh. One particular moment. So I will actually have to say that it wasn't even my moment, if I'm being completely honest. I had already started writing. I had even started publishing, and I did not know that it could be my full-time job because, especially at the time, but even now to a certain extent, authors tended to not talk about money. And romance is a genre primarily written by women for women. And then publishers also at the time preferred for people to keep it quiet. So really there was like this big question mark to me of it wasn't like you could just look it up on Indeed, like how much does a software developer make? How much does an author make? And so I had this huge question mark. I didn't even know it was possible. And there was this author who at the time was really successful, like wildly successful. And I thought to myself, I'm never going to be as big as her. That's what I thought at the time. And she did this really gracious thing in an environment where it was pretty taboo to talk about money. She just opened her numbers for a year and was like, this is how much I made. And it was $300,000, which I was like, at the time I said, I'm never going to reach that, but at least I know that if I got even a third of what she got, then I could replace my income, support my family, that kind of thing. And so that's one of the reasons why, even though it's scary and it's still taboo to an extent, and it can lead to a little bit of backlash occasionally, like I try to share certain things about what I do and about my numbers because it can be that help to someone who is just wondering what's even possible.
I love that. And we are going to talk about money because I think it's really important. There are a lot of people, women in particular, who are looking for this exact thing. They're looking for something they can do that's fulfilling, that's maybe out of the box, that allows them to take care of their families and their loved ones without having to kill themselves and leave their families in order to do that. And so I think what you're doing is really important. And it's also allowing you to tap into your creativity in such a really fun and beautiful way. And doesn't everyone want to do something that allows them to break out and be who they always wanted to be?
It's so funny. It's absolutely surreal to have a job that you get to make things up and then you get paid for that. So that part never actually stops being surreal. It stays that way. And we have in our field our own challenges like marketing but I don't think they're actually that specific to us. I do feel like authors sometimes be like, the life of an author is so hard. And while I agree in general, I remember like I was on, because authors have the same thing, like TikTok is out. Should we dance to sell our books? And I was literally on TikTok and I saw this poor guy working at a car dealership dancing. And I was like, listen, we all have the same problems. Okay. But yeah, no, I love this job for women specifically because so many authors that I know are, for a lot of times, like very few of them come out of college and do this job. They usually have some other career first. In my case, it was software developer. We have a lot of lawyers. We have the occasional doctor. We have a lot of people from tech. And they get burned out because the corporate world doesn't have a lot of flexibility, right? Particularly lawyers who have those like crazy billable hour requirements. And a lot of the women are taking care of their children. A lot of them are homeschooling while they do this quote full-time job, which they couldn't do any other job like that. And then, or they're taking care of their elderly parents or things like that. So it's a lot of freedom. I think it's a beautiful thing if you are called to write stories.
I could not love that more. And I actually looked into that as a career at one point, and I'll talk about that as we get through. But I'm wondering if you were always prone to writing, even as a child. Were you that kind of a kid? Did you
You know
write?
what's so funny is that I wasn't. And it's something that still to this day, even though I'm like more over it now, gave me a lot of imposter syndrome because you will meet a lot of people, both professional authors, but even people who aren't, who will say, oh, I was writing since I was little. I had all these stories, I had these poems, whatever. And that really isn't something that I did. In fact, if anything, I was more of a math and science girl. And so I always loved books. I love to read. Sometimes I think back to what I thought about authors, and I almost felt they were too otherworldly for me. I was like, I can't be one of those like gods that end up in libraries and things like that. That just felt too, I was like, I could probably be an astronaut, but not that.
So interesting. The astronaut felt more attainable. That's so
I was a little
interesting.
bit of a tomboy. Like I had a black belt. Yeah, it was like a whole thing with me. And I really just felt more comfortable being almost like boyish or traditionally boyish. And it really wasn't until my son was born that I felt like giving birth to him actually changed me physically and and certainly like emotionally. And it's like suddenly this like feminine side of me came out and was like, we're here now. We're not going to be ignored anymore.
Okay. Let's go into that a little bit. So when you were growing up and you were taking on kind of a tomboy role, and I have to say, I always felt a lot of that masculine kind of energy as well as a child, and going outside, playing, horsing around, that kind of stuff. But it sounds to me that if you are someone who had maybe like a black belt, that maybe there was something about fantasy that came into your childhood. Did you have fantasies or play out action types of roles?
So I will say I realized later that I always had stories in my head, but it just never even occurred to me to write them down or that other people would want to hear them. I wasn't a storyteller, like even out loud or anything like that. But I think that at that time, it was the positive thing we told girls is you can do anything you want. Just do it more like this, more like the boys are doing. I remember in like my first corporate job, I read this book. Oh my gosh, why can't I remember the name? It was something like How to Act Like a Man, basically. The title actually said it. And I read it like just enthusiastically, ready to learn because this is what we're told. This is what success is. And I remember it was a lot about asking for what you're worth. And I remember I walked into, it was like a smallish business, but a pretty successful business. And I walked into the office and I asked for a $15,000 a year raise and I got it. And I was like, the book is right. This is the way to do it. That just affirms everything. And so what I really love about the romance community and also like the coaching community and other parts of business that we're seeing now is that feminine energy really being allowed to take up space and say, actually, we can find success in a completely other way. It's going to look very different.
That's a very good point to make. And maybe we just need to call it something different. We refer to it as acting like a man or being masculine, but maybe it's not that. Maybe it's just a different type of energy that we can harness, the energy of success. Like, why does that have to be associated with those masculine attributes? Women can emulate those things too, right?
It's funny. I think I've been thinking a lot lately about the word authority because I had actually built up this team and it was pretty big. Like at one point, I think I had 5 W-2 employees. That wasn't counting contractors. And I did that because I feel like the message that I was receiving was that's the only way to grow. That's the only way to have a more successful business is that you need a team. And so I had this team and there were many reasons why I couldn't make it work. And I was really unhappy. And I'm really grateful that I had a mentor who was like, you actually don't need to do that. And I was like, oh my God, thank you for that permission. But looking back on it, I know that I never, even as I had them and I did all this work to make it a good team. I had like training and mentorship and standard operating procedures and like all the things they say to do. If you want a good, smooth team where everyone can be happy, I was like, what are your goals? What I lacked was stepping into my authority and just saying, you actually have to do the job very well. That's why you're being paid. And I couldn't do that. I was just like, okay, there was like a mistake. Let's just go over it again. And I couldn't embody that authority.
Mm-hmm. And authority is genderless.
Exactly. Exactly.
And it is true that when you are putting together people who are going to support you or putting together a team, that people do have to do their jobs and we have to be able to articulate that.
I was thinking about it and I don't even remember what the reference was, but it was something about someone auditioning to be a backup dancer for Beyonce. And I just remember thinking, God, how many people must audition? And there's still this part of me that's, don't you feel bad when you say no to them? And I'm like, I don't think Beyonce feels bad. You know what I mean? What I feel is she's going to be like, no, get even better. Like, just give me the actual best. This is not.
Wants the best dancers there. She wants the best dancers.
Exactly. There's still a piece that I'm missing there. And I ultimately think I can't run a team until I can do that. Right. That's an essential part.
Okay. Is there anything you can think of from growing up or in your childhood that you think might be the root of that inability to stand in your authority?
You know what I learned? It was actually pretty recently, like in the last, I don't know, 6 months to a year, which is pretty recent in the grand scheme of things, that I actually have an aversion to authority, which took me by surprise because overall I'm a rule follower. Like I got the A's and I got whatever. So I don't appear outwardly like someone who has an issue with authority. But there were these things where if I'll do it to make things smooth, but I really don't necessarily respect authority unless I feel that they are understanding what's happening and things like that. I actually have this what really got me is when I started thinking about this, I have this teapot that's been sitting on my windowsill that I bought and it says, don't tell me what to do. And I was like, how did I buy this and not know? Anyway, so my idea with that is, okay, if I have a problem with authority, then why would I want to become authority? You know what I mean?
Is there some fear of authority?
Probably, yeah, this like sort of misuse, that like underlying belief, oh, if you have the power, you'll misuse it. And I follow a lot of places that are focused on social justice and I care deeply about it. And one of the things they'll often talk about is like the poor way that employees are treated. And I was just so determined I'm like, it's this teeny tiny thing. And I'm like, yes, you get weeks of pay time off. And yes, you get health benefit. I was just like so determined to make this a good place to work that I was like overlooking like the most important part. Like we've got to actually have a team that makes more money with the team than without. That's just core. You have to learn by doing sometimes.
That's so true. I see that happening a lot in the world when people are trying to stand up for doing, quote, the right thing. And then they find out the reasons why the system is working the way it is, because there really is a bottom line. Like there are reasons behind it and we need to be able to strike a balance. So that's really interesting that you brought that up. So what did your family look like when you were growing up?
So it was a little divided. My parents split early. There was a lot of anger there. There was some trauma there. So it was generally not a happy time. And so I was so happy to get to college, basically. I was just counting down the days and I was just like, anything that happens now will be fine. I'm on my own. My husband and I actually started dating when I was in high school. We moved in together almost immediately, which I obviously don't recommend for a young girl to do. I was determined and we did it. And we had no money. He came from the same sort of background where he was going to college and sending money home. Basically, we're sitting there survive. Like we would drive extra to go to the Taco Bell that sold bean burritos for 69 cents instead of 99 cents because that's how much it mattered. That stuff was hard. But I also know we wouldn't have changed it for anything. We were like, the independence is all we wanted. And ever since then, it's just been the very long, sometimes difficult journey of crafting the life that we want. And really early on, we thought that life was about material things, not because we cared only about material things, but because we didn't have them. And we are like, when you don't have them, you really understand how important they are. And then once we got them and we're still struggling, we're like, oh, wait, maybe we should actually start thinking about our health. And maybe we should actually, I don't know, unpack a little bit of that trauma. And then we're like, oh, wow, this is going to be a long journey.
The journey of self-discovery is the most important journey you can take.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about when you met your husband and how the story, is there like a story about that?
So we actually first met at a mutual birthday. We saw each other. We didn't talk. The first time we spoke was actually at a community garden outside of a church. And we were both there for how you do clubs in high school and they do like community service. So he was actually the president of the club and I was just like attending. And we were the only two people there. It was so cold. And it was like my first time going. So I don't know anything about gardening. And he's been doing it for a while. So he's telling me or whatever. And we just started talking. And we actually did not start dating until he was a freshman in college. He came back for Thanksgiving and we were just talking and he was like, let me take you out. So he comes and picks me up and we drive around and realize that literally nothing is open on Thanksgiving. So we just sit in a parking lot and talk for hours. And it was wild because we were both like, is this it? It feels like it's it. Like we're not supposed to say it. We know we're not supposed to say it, right? Everyone would say we're crazy. And even we think we're crazy, but it still feels like it. And then here we are. This many years later, we have a 16-year-old just got his license.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. And so you both decided you were going to be for each other at that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Young love.
Yeah. Of course, my dad was like, I give it 6 months. And so I delight in proving him wrong.
And you moved in together right away.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was the best thing about that? And what was the hardest thing about that?
The best thing is that when you come from a family that didn't necessarily have like safe intimacy is actually having that. Having people like when you come from houses that are like a little bit more traumatic, it's what's going to happen when I go into, even going into the kitchen can be like fraught. And so it just felt like freedom. I can do anything I want. All I want to do is sit here, but that's all I wanted to do anyway. And yeah, and having that support, it was everything really. I think there was a definite downside in terms of when two people, but I don't know if we actually could have overcome it because the thing is when two people start dating at like the age of 35 or whatever, they know a lot about themselves and what they want in a relationship, what they don't want, how they want to live, because they've experimented a little. And you don't know that when you're 18. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of stumbling and trying again and trying things that didn't work and then being like, oh, let's go in this direction. And then the other thing is we were both in computer science together at University of Texas. And then we both did that job outside tech, worked in tech. And when we were out, and so then when I started writing, he supported me, but he didn't really get it. And he also didn't really think it would be permanent. He was like, this is a thing you're doing right now. And it was nice actually to be able to spend more time with my son. That was the most important thing to me, and to be able to replace some of that income while I did that. But then, so he was, one day you'll go back. And I was like, yeah, maybe one day I'll go back. But then I keep living. And in a way, I still don't plan. If you're like, what are you going to do in 20 years? Are you still going to be an author? I don't know. There are people who are like, absolutely. And actually, I think that's way more common to see. And I don't know. I feel sometimes like maybe I commit in my marriage, but I'm like a little bit of a player when it comes to my career. Just want to see how it goes. But yeah, your job is just something you spend too much time doing to be unhappy. So I'll do it while it's working for me. And I don't feel a lot of pressure to decide whether I'll still be doing it.
I think that's a really healthy way of looking at things because when you have an open mindedness and a flexibility, life always brings you to the next step successfully. You always get there. Did you
Well,
start writing when your son was a baby?
oh, yeah.
Like on maternity leave? That's when it came about?
Yes. I'm sitting there nursing and I call my son like a starfish because he's always attached. And so there's a lot of sitting, right? And my husband got me like they were pretty new at the time, iPhone. And I'm just scrolling basically like mom forums while I'm trying to learn stuff. And then alternately the Kindle. And one thing about the romance genre is that most people don't necessarily know it's the biggest genre based on sales, actually by a lot. And the reason why people don't often know that is because it's actually hard to visibly see. A lot of indie bookstores won't even carry it. The bigger bookstores usually do carry it, but they'll often put it in the back or not necessarily. We're seeing that some of that change now, specifically with like Book Talk. But for really most of time, it has still been at the top, which I think is really telling. It's like we hide these books and you still manage to find them more than any other book. I did not know the romance genre existed. I would just read regular old general fiction books, literary books. And I would always enjoy when there was a nice romance in the story, but I did not actually know there was an entire genre, whole shelves of books that were all I wanted to read. And so I discovered it on the Kindle because it's a little bit more democratic in terms of if you find something, it'll be like, here's something else. And it doesn't like artificially suppress romance books. And so I was able to discover them and went down that rabbit hole, read just like everything I could get my hands on. And especially at that time, traditional publishers were still 99.9% of all books published. And they had a sort of narrower vision of what even could be published. They were like certain types of stories, darker stories. Readers don't want that. They want lighthearted things. And so the more that self-publishing came about, authors were like, I'll take my sort of darker story and I'll publish it. And turns out readers actually did want it. And so now dark is a word that can mean a lot of different things, but like one of the things that I wanted to see, oftentimes you would see a heroine who would have a friend and the friend maybe had experienced assault. And she would be held up as this like cautionary tale. At least that didn't happen to you. Thank goodness you're saved from that fate and you get your happy ending with the hero. And she's left out there. That was just a recurring thing that I saw. And of course, like it hurt my heart. And I was like, no, I specifically want a story where that person gets the happily ever after. And there were a few of them out there. So I read percentage wise, tiny. And I just kept looking for more and more. And I kept looking with more and more specificity until I realized, you know why I'm not finding this book? Because it's so specific. It's just the story in my head. And the only way for it to exist is for me to write it. And I really started writing it because here's the thing, you can have a story in your head all day long and never write it down. You could also write it down and never publish it, which a lot of people do. The only point of publishing is to reach someone. And so when I wrote it with the intention to eventually publish, that was my thought. There's maybe not a lot of people. I actually didn't believe it was a lot of people because I believed the publishers at the time. But I was like, listen, there may not be a ton of people, but there's at least a handful. There's one or two out there in the world who are like me looking for this story because they need it for hope and for healing. But lo and behold, 10 years later, 10 plus years later, it turns out that a lot of women were looking for those books because a lot of women have those experiences, unfortunately. Yeah.
So how much of your writing is about healing?
I really think that every story is about healing. And like one of the things we talk about is we'll use the term like character arc. Someone needs a character arc. But when you dissect the pieces of what is a character arc, it's usually them finding something that they thought was their identity and realizing that it wasn't all along. And that thing was holding them back from happiness. And often it was holding them back from, let's say, love or romantic love. But it also encompasses familial love and career and all of these other things on both sides. It's actually both the heroine and the hero need a character arc, which is what sort of differentiates it from other stories. I was lucky enough to attend very early on a talk by Michael Haig, who primarily teaches on screenwriting, but he was teaching a group of romance authors about story structure. And he was like, yeah, this is how it works. And whenever you say, that's just how I am, that's your identity. And he really made no distinction between what a character goes through and what we go through. And that's why, to me, it's always been the same. Kind of like when I'm like digging my heels in, I'm like, that's an old version of me.
Of all the characters that you've written, is there one that you really resonate with?
There's one really early on that came up for me just now. Actually, I thought usually when people ask me what's my favorite book, I always say it's the one that I'm working on now because it has to be. Because if I'm not like desperately in love with it, like I can't even write it, you know. But I do think there's something that happens when I discover a new author where, and I love their books and I start reading them, is I really love to go back to their first books because there's something raw there. And no matter how hard you try as an artist, or at least for this has been my experience, if you are actually putting your work out there and people are giving feedback in any way, shape, or form, whether it's comments, reviews, or just purchases, there's part of you that understands what's happening. And so therefore, for me, like it's just like a natural sort of commercialization of making it more acceptable for people. And so I have to fight that. But I really actually think it's universal because when I go back to someone's first book, I really am like, this is the essence of this author. This is the story they're trying to tell. And then you see it get smoothed out. And in a way, that's a good thing because then it can reach more people. Sometimes the raw edges are too much for people. But I personally am always interested in going back to the first. And that's what I thought of. Like I have a character named Allie who is a very, I guess, like harsh character. Like she has had some bad things happen and she didn't react to it with the humble grace that we would all maybe hope to, but maybe it's slightly more realistic, like hardened shell. And when a lot of people, like when I was publishing that book, where if they didn't like it, they'd be like, this is terrible. Women shouldn't act that way. But if they, even if they did like it, they're like, this is edgy. But I just love realism. And I love showing that people who you traditionally think maybe don't get a happy ending can actually have them and that they deserve them.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So you're writing happy endings for all kinds of people.
Yeah.
Who are you hoping to be able to help with your stories?
So I think that my stories are always, as society has progressed over the years that I've been writing, and like I said, my son is 16, so it's been many years. And so the whole landscape has changed, right? Like feminism has become a little bit more normalized. And like we had the Me Too movement and things like that. And so one of the conversations that often comes up is the topic of agency and heroines having agency in books, which agency is typically defined as like choosing her own destiny / power. And so they're like, oh, I don't want to see an old fashioned heroine, damsel in distress. I want to see a woman who's a CEO or a biologist and she's in her power and she's making moves and she does find love, but it's incidental and she doesn't need it and all it just need is help and all those things. And so I want to be really clear. I read those books. I love those books and I absolutely believe they should exist in a feminist space. But for me, I've always been drawn to write books that are still about agency to me, but they're where the heroine doesn't start with it. Because to me, that's the story that I lived and that I really feel like so many women live. It's like when I'm the CEO in my power and I don't really need a man and everything, that's the end of the story. That's the happy ending. Whether or not she even does find a man. I'm like, what about before that though? How did you get there if you didn't already start from this super high vibrational place? And that's the story that I'm interested in. So yeah, I'm writing stories about heroines who start off basically with no power and showing them evolve to have it. And I'm trying to reach the people who, here's the thing, like sometimes you'll see readers say something like, oh, I want a strong heroine and not a weak one, not a weak one. And I'm like, listen, they're all strong heroines. Look around. Every woman is doing 5 jobs and also worrying about what she eats and also worrying about this and also like, have I put on enough makeup? Have I put on too much makeup? Like, it's over the top. That's like what the Barbie movie was about. But it was like, so that's why I think the average woman is already strong. And I just want to showcase that story.
It's just about uncovering the natural strength that already exists.
Mm-hmm. And in a way, also, like we were talking about earlier, maybe it was always there, but we weren't calling it that.
Yeah.
Because it didn't look like someone else's strength.
Right. Interesting. As you're talking, it makes me think about our earlier conversation about the idea of authority. And I think you just answered the question I had asked earlier about your own walk with authority, like where it
Yeah.
came from.
Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting. I love that. So I have a lot of curiosity about the writing world because I had tried to write a romance novel. I actually did write a romance novel, and it was a quite a long process. And I think I got to 60 or 70,000 words. I sent it off to an editor. She gave it back to me with all of these corrections that I have to make. And I thought to myself, wow, how does a person write so many novels so quickly? Because I know in your world, that's what happens. I joined some Reddit forums at the time to learn about romance writing. And I know that the people are writing, even some people are writing one a month and they're cranking them out. So that seems like a lot of pressure and a very fast pace. So tell us about your writing process. How fast are you writing these? What's it like for you?
Yeah, I think it's something that takes people by surprise when they come from maybe the coaching world and they see people be authors, but that typically means I just have one book or maybe two books. And then, but when someone does that successfully, they're still typically not making their income from that book. They're making their income with consulting and speaking engagements on top of the book. To actually make money from books themselves, you're going to need vaguely several eventually. And you also need volume. You need enough people to be reading them because it's not like they're going to come in and then pay you a couple $1,000s. Like that $4.99 they shelled out, the book, it's done. And yeah, it's interesting. I read Shonda Rhimes. Shonda Rhimes, she did Bridgerton among many other things, but she has a memoir. I think it was called The Year of Yes. And I did really enjoy that memoir, but she talks about it as like laying track. Like you've got to lay the track because the train is coming. And it's not actually, so that's her being a showrunner on TV, where literally the train is coming because actors are all coming into a room and like there better be something for them to read. It's actually not as intense for a novelist. We can set our own pace. We actually just put the pressure on ourselves because of that sort of attention thing, right? Like someone who is releasing something every month has a natural kind of like thing to go out and tell people about that someone who's releasing every year is not going to have. And so finding the balance, I think we're all working on it always. I typically release 3 or 4 books a year, and they're typically about 50K each. And so that's like a pace that I've set for a while. So it's been up sometimes, it's been down sometimes. Last year was a down year because I had a couple of health things with me and my husband's. I'm really excited that I'm back in writing and it's flowing and it feels so good. But here's the thing. It's like the word flow. Because when you're flowing, the words come and it doesn't always happen. And you have to write anyway. That's the hard part. But there's nothing better than the feeling of being in flow. And I think it's the same as if you were a violinist. Like when she is really playing to her fullest capacity and pouring herself into the song, whether she's doing it on a stage or just in the comfort of her own home, it's actually feeding her, right? Like it's not even, in a way, it's expending energy, but it's also giving her something back. And so I think that's the situation that you need in order to do this job, because it does require you to actually write a lot.
Yeah. I love that you just said that. It's like a giving and receiving of energy. The process for you is a giving and receiving. That's a beautiful way to describe flow and also to get people to understand the intensity of the process. When you are writing a book or coming up with ideas for a book, where do these stories come from?
So a lot of places, but I think most commonly for me, what I really love, and this is why it's interesting that you use the word healing, because I actually have always used the word redemption, but I almost think healing is more appropriate. But I've always had pretty much all my books are about redemption. And one of the things I like to do, or just happens organically, is I'll be reading a book, watching a movie, whatever, or just thinking back on what I've seen before or thinking about something. And the villain, I'll just be curious about them. I'll be like, why are they like this? And then I'll say, could I redeem them? Is a really interesting question for me. If I were to write their story, could I redeem them? And oftentimes it's not like I take the hero as is, right? Like he's maybe two-dimensional evil. I'm not going to do like that. But that's almost the challenge for me. How far could you go and still be redeemed? And I think every author has a different opinion on that. And probably every reader does too. But it's definitely an interesting topic for me.
Is it personal?
I don't know. I think it's playing with even the idea of good and evil. Yeah. It's what does that sort of even mean? And I remember I did these two books with a friend of mine and co-writer Annika Martin, and they're particularly dark books that we did. And we ended up talking about them at conferences and things like that. And so we did, and she's also great at character. So we did this like deep thinking about them. And we were like, wait, they absolutely have a code of honor. They have rules that they follow, that they set for themselves. They just don't match society's rules. And that's why they're called an anti-hero. But it's who set society rules in the first place. Obviously, some society rules I agree with, some I don't.
It reminds me of the idea that good people can do bad things and bad people can do good things.
Yeah.
Now, when you say dark, what do you mean? What's the darkest thing? And you can say anything on this podcast.
There's definitely a range. I actually used to write really dark stuff. And I would say stuff that included like heroes who were just like objectively bad, like kidnapping.
Okay.
And I wrote those books like with tears in my eyes, literally just like crying. And imagine this, like I'm going to work all day in my like corporate suit and like doing my programming, and then come home, spend time with my son. Obviously he's a baby. And then at like midnight when I should be asleep so I can wake up and do it the next day, I'm like, I'm sitting on the floor typing and just like crying. And it was so cathartic. We call these books, there's a lot of things you can call these books. You can call them dark, you can call them subversive, is typically what I call them. And I think there's definitely, that's why I'm like, I wrote those books. I wrote them for me, first of all, but then I also wrote them for the few other people who needed that, who needed to read that and cry and then just move on a little bit. It's like reclaiming the narrative. And I understand totally that some people don't have any experiences and they just read it for the thrill of it, which is perfectly fine with me as well, because even if it is something that's, let's say, more on the fantasy side, like a sexual fantasy or something like that, what a safe place to explore that, right? You're literally sitting on your couch. So you have these thoughts. And so I think, yeah, what society tries to say, like non-consensual fantasy is the most common sexual fantasy that women have. And so the correct, in some key places, idea of what women should do is just be ashamed instead of being like, hey, this is just, who knows why we have it, evolution, whatever, but you have it. Okay, play with it a little. You can read a book, you can do role play, you can do whatever you need to do in a safe place, and you don't have to feel ashamed. As time has gone on, my books have gotten less dark. And it's one of those terrible things. There's like a stereotype of artists where they need their mental illness in order to create art. I absolutely did not want that to be true. I almost didn't believe it like with my whole heart, just because I was like, I didn't want it to be true. But unfortunately, it was true for me. I had to relearn how to write as my depression improved. And I couldn't really write the same kind of books, much to the dismay of my readers who had come to expect that. If a career is going to evolve with you over decades, then it's going to change.
We are supposed to change.
Yeah.
I love that your current work reflects that healing that you've done.
Yeah.
And you've talked a little bit about chronic illness and you mentioned depression. So let's talk a little bit about that part of your story.
Yeah. So I did always know that I had depression on some level. I had made some like small attempts to treat it, but not really. And I think one of the reasons why it was very hard to really take seriously or even diagnose at a certain point is that I never really felt sad. And what would happen is I would shut down. So are you feeling sad? No, I don't feel anything actually, which is not great. Now we know, but especially even now, So it was like a few years into my career. I was already full time. I think my son was already in kindergarten. So I'm very established at that point. That's my career. And I'm a workaholic. I've always been a workaholic my whole life. Like I said, I'm like writing at midnight before I eventually ended up leaving that job. And I was still working a lot of hours. If I wasn't working, I was playing with my kids or my dogs. I was always doing something. And then suddenly I was like sleeping 18 hours a day. And even the hours that I was awake, I was dizzy. I would literally run into something. And it was just a terrible migraine. It was a sort of miserable existence. And because I didn't feel sad, and because all of these symptoms were happening to me were so sudden, which is typically not how we think of mental illness. And because they felt so physical to me, I was like, this is obviously a physical problem. And so I went to first just a general doctor, and she looked me over, was like, I don't really see anything wrong. She actually did ask me a question. Do you ever have thoughts of self-harm? Do you feel like you might be depressed? And I said, no, I don't really think so. And she looks at me and she says, I'm like in a cheerful mood and I'm dressed like whatever. And she's like, yeah, that's not you. Like she just, a medical doctor is now. And I then go on to see a bunch of specialists, and it takes a long time and it's hard because we have to advocate for me, my husband and I both, because every doctor says there's nothing wrong with you. And I'm like, but I'm sleeping 18 hours a day. And they were like, nothing came up on any of our tests that we run. Therefore, you just go away. And it was so frustrating and so lonely and scary. And because is this going to be my whole life then? And we finally found this neurologist who did the same thing where she's, I'm not finding anything here, but why don't you go see this specialist friend of mine and then come back if it's not that. So we tried that, come back. She's like, okay, what I hoped I could have found earlier is someone to say, listen, we don't know what it is, but here's a thought. Why don't we try a low dose of something and you go home and just see if it helps? And lo and behold, I don't know if it was the first thing we tried. We found something that helps. And she's, this kind of helps for depression. Do you think it might be that? And we settled on the idea that it was probably that. And so I ended up then at that point finding a psychiatrist who was great because I also have it particularly treatment resistant. And so we went through a lot of treatments before finding something that really helped. And it's been a journey. It's been a journey. And I felt like almost like an alien. I was like, what is wrong with me that this is happening to me and no doctors know what's going on? It was only many years later when I was already feeling much better and more secure. And I would talk about my story a little bit, and I would have women coming in saying, oh my God, me too. And then I was like, wow, this is actually a whole epidemic. So
people don't realize that things like depression and anxiety have physical symptoms.
Yep.
And you do feel like you are an oddball. And the medical gaslighting is a real problem.
In all of my even really bad depressive episodes, it's, do you feel hope for the future? Yeah, I do. Do you feel like the world's a good place? Yeah, I do. What do you love? I love these flowers. I love to eat this. Like I just presented in a lot of ways like someone who people think is not depressed, but can you get out of bed? No. Okay. So that's the problem.
Yeah. I just read about this in the book Mindset by Carol Dweck. And she talks about people with depression who have a fixed mindset and people with depression who have a growth mindset presenting differently. And the people who have a growth mindset, which are typically creative people who are able to see the world through the lens of open-mindedness and that sort of thing, those people are the ones who don't feel sad when they're depressed because they're always trying to get better. They're always trying to do the next thing. They're always trying to continue on. And that is why it's hard to recognize depression in people with that kind of a mindset. I wonder if that's what happened to you.
Yeah. And I also think that I know that I've not been very connected to my body. It's something that I've been working on for a little while, but for a long time I didn't. I was happy to not be connected to my body. And you hear sometimes this idea of like self-care and listen to your body. And I was like, my body always wants to like sit down. So why would I do that? I'm not. And it's okay. So you're never going to listen to your body because you're like at odds. You're like fighting with it. Your body is maybe just rest for a year. And I'm like, society doesn't work that way. I can't do that. So it's, yeah, my body needed something I just couldn't give it. And so it really like forcefully took it, because like, I also want to say, like, when I say I couldn't get out of bed, I don't mean I just was like too in the doldrums. I was like asleep. It was like, I actually got checked for, why can't I think of it? When you fall asleep suddenly,
Narcolepsy?
because that's what it felt like. Like, I want to be awake and then I'm asleep. And I was never a napper. I was never a sleep inner. I was a doer. And so it was very hard. And if there's one thing that I wish I could affect more change about, it's this, but it's so hard because I understand completely where they're coming from, because I see women burning the candle from both ends and just saying, I'll just figure it out. I'll just figure it out. And I'm like, yeah, that might work for you up until the end, but I've been down that road just with my body and it did not work out for me in the end. So, and it's so hard because when you, like I said, it's society that tells us we should have a full-time job and take care of our elderly parents and do everything. And there's just like physically not enough to do that.
Yes. And when you end up with a perfect storm of things, the universe will shut you down. It will say, stop.
Yeah. It will stop you on its own. And that's one thing. Like, I always was just like, you know what, my willpower, I had full confidence in my willpower. I had too much confidence in my willpower. I was like, it had done a lot. You know what I'm saying?
Mindset. You have the growth mindset.
And then it was like, wait, my willpower cannot overcome this. This is going to be a problem.
I'm really glad that you're feeling better now. And since you've been working through that, and you said that it actually changed the tone of your writing.
Yeah.
Do you feel that progress? Do you feel better?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. You know what I think it is, because I've been working on this, is that things are so good. This is going to sound, someone's going to be so annoyed at me for saying this, but things are so good. And I just don't know how to exist in it. But like, my nervous system this is weird. This is not safe. Sorry, my dog is barking.
That's okay.
And yeah, I'm just like, I can't just accept it. I shouldn't say that. I'm working on accepting it.
You're on the way. You haven't fully accepted it yet. If you were looking at the timeline of your whole writing career from when you started writing the books until the future, what would be the percentage that you say you are in your evolution as a writer? Like the healing evolution.
Oh, yeah. Definitely not all the way there.
And do you think, you said you didn't know how long you would be a writer. So if the writing is about this process of healing for you, when you get to the point where you feel enough healing has taken place, will that be the end?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's real to say, oh, I make up stuff and I sell it. But it's also not real, because I don't just sit there and say, what's a random guy I could write? What's a random girl I could write? It's characters come to me and then they just like simmer in the back. Like, stories usually simmer for a couple of years actually before I even write them. And if there was nothing, I picture it like, if you ever saw Harry Potter 3, the pensieve that Dumbledore has, I picture it like that. I just pluck out a story that's been in there for a while. And if I reached in and there was no story, I don't know why I would write. I could manufacture something. I know how to do that because I've written enough stories.
You know the formula now, right?
But yeah, there would be no point. I just wouldn't,
Okay. I think that is very fascinating way to describe it. And I'm going to sit with that for a bit. All right. I want to talk a little bit about the money part of it, because money is important. And in the world, the coaching world, personal development world, it's not something we shy away from. People talk about it and it's a new thing. This whole like, okay, women making money. Like when I went to college to be a teacher, I didn't really think about the money part of it. And I remember at the time I had a roommate that was going into business and it wasn't very common. There weren't a lot of women in the business program. And she was very focused on the idea of making money. And it was so foreign to me. And then as I grew up and realized how important it is, and also I'm divorced, I've been a single mom. And if I had focused more on making my own way and my own money in the world in a stronger way, maybe a different profession where I could have provided better, it would have changed the whole game for me. And there shouldn't be gatekeeping around money. Like, we can all make a good living and make money doing things that we love. But I don't know why we have been traditionally afraid to have that conversation. So let's talk about it a little bit. In your best year, would you tell us how much money you made?
Seven
Are you
figures.
comfortable with that?
Yeah.
How much is that?
7 figures.
Oh, 7 figures in 1 year. So you have made 7 figures writing 3 books a year.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. It's volume because it comes from book sales. It comes from if you buy a book on Amazon right now for $4.99, I get, I think, $3.50.
Yeah.
You divide it, and that's about how many books were sold.
So how did you get so popular?
So here's the real way. I always did the things I was supposed to do. Like there were certain prescribed marketing activities. I don't know if the coaching industry had it, but like blog tours were popular when I started, and I would do those things and they would just do okay. I was like, I will say this. I was lucky enough to make, I think my first year I made like $30,000. And so a lot of authors start smaller than that. And I can't claim that I had any marketing skill that did that. It was like a combination of luck and also I think writing a story that wasn't as much being told. And I also think the rawness I eventually discovered would be a factor. But then things leveled out. They were going linearly, basically. So they were getting bigger every year, but it was linear. And I actually thought that was fine, again, because I didn't know what is normal or what is not. And I was in this private author group and someone had asked, what did you make your first year, second year, third year? And someone said something like $350 their first year and just like $100,000 their second year. And I was like, wait, I'm missing something. Because if that jump is possible, what am I doing? And so I tried to do marketing. It was moderately successful in the respect that I could, I think, almost replace my full-time income. And I could have continued doing that indefinitely. And that would have been fine, which I would say is about $100,000. And then the depression hit. And we did need the money that I was making to live our lives. And it's not even, usually you think, oh, if I were not working anymore, I could do more around the house. We wouldn't need cleaners. I could cook dinner every night. You can't do that if you're asleep. So it's actually, we needed more help to even exist. And so I'm like, we need this money. What am I going to do? I could only sit upright for 2 hours a day. And so I would literally sit down at my desk. It was in our old house, but I would sit down just like this. And I would think to myself, how are you going to make the royalties be $500 or whatever I needed to be? And the answer for me ended up not even being writing books, because the truth is I could never write fast enough to just produce. Obviously, you do need the books as well, but I wasn't fast enough to make that sort of happen on its own. It wasn't just going to snowball on its own, or it hadn't done so in the years that I had done it. And then someone told me about Facebook ads. And I ran my very first Facebook ad. I think I boosted, I didn't know anything about them. So it was literally just like a random social media post that I boosted for like $200. And then at the end, I added everything up that I made from it. And I think it was like $215. So not a very impressive return, right? But here's the thing, it blew my mind because we had just done so many types of promotion that were so much work, and in some cases, so much money with no measurable return. So with no measurable return, it might be zero. And like a common thing would just be like to actually put an ad in the Kirkus magazine. So you're there, but like how many books were sold? And so I was like, this is where the science part shone, because I was like, wait, so if I can make $15, then I can make more. And so then I just kept reinvesting. So even though I started earning more with those ads, I wasn't taking more out really. I was reinvesting that into ads. I was getting better at ads until my return could be 1.5, until my return could be 2 times. And then to get to the next level, actually, I was able to take what I learned from running ads to actually produce better packaging, which I think is ultimately the key. If someone comes to me and they're like, the Facebook ads aren't working, like maybe it's the Facebook ads or maybe it's what you're sending them to. You can't know until you test. And so I test everything. My covers are tested. My titles are tested. My blurbs are tested. Obviously, when I'm actually running ads, there are many variations of ads that are tested. And what I found is just that people have their own opinion, and due to this confirmation bias and the fact that we're human, we're just pretty sure it's right. We're like, what sells? A flower on the cover, or what sells? A shirtless guy on the cover. And we just think, I have seen enough in the world that I know this to be true. But when you actually look at the data, it's so scattershot. It doesn't necessarily, like, there's no one person nailing it. I don't even try to nail it. I just, the way that I look at it is I let the readers tell me what they want on the cover. All I have to do, and it is a task, is first of all, be willing to test, and then also be creative enough to come up with the options so that they can pick what they actually love. So it's not a small thing, but I think I reached a point with one of my series where I got 10 times ROI. And yeah, Facebook ads absolutely changed my life. It was after that I started speaking at some conferences I was invited to speak at. And then I eventually have run like some courses specifically for authors, and have met so many incredible people who are in the same situation. And it's, because here's the thing, if you've written so many books too, the more books you write, your new readers are not necessarily finding them. Sometimes they do, obviously. Sometimes a reader goes all the way back through. But sometimes those old books just languish, and then you just run Facebook ads and now they're selling. And like I said, it's a big task. That's why I have a course on it. There's other courses on it. The most important thing about Facebook ads I can say is test, don't assume anything. Whenever I start to get a big head and I'm like, no, I think I know what the answer is going to be, I challenge myself. I think it's that authority thing again. I challenge myself. I'm like, prove it. And then I go run the test. And then it doesn't even matter what I thought, because now I know the real answer.
Yeah. When you're running those Facebook ads, is that something where you have to spend a lot of money to make a lot of money?
So yes and no. Like I said, let's say you're averaging 2 times ROI. Then it's just a question of what you want to spend. But what I have found, there is a cap. There is, at some point, you would spend enough because of the way Facebook ads work, and most social media ads are a bidding system. So if you spend enough, then you start reaching this higher echelon of people where it's not going to be 2 times ROI. But let's say that number is $2,000, right? Let's just say that's what it is. And so I'll talk to someone and they'll be like, yeah, I'm like, if sometimes people ask me, like, how do I make more money? How do I grow my business? Whatever. And if they say that, I'll say it's not the only thing I talk about, but I'll say, are you running ads? And they'll say, yeah. Is it profitable? Yeah. Cool. How much are you spending? $100 a day. Why are you spending $100 a day? I don't know. There's almost never an answer. If you truly wanted to maximize your income, which not everyone does, and that's perfectly fine. But if someone's coming to me, then obviously they do. Then it's like the only real answer would be, I tried it and I could not still make it profitable. But typically that number is higher than what people are spending. Most people who are already running profitable ads can go up.
I think that's really interesting. And a lot of people listening will find that useful, because you do have to put in more to get more out. You have to invest. I think that's true, like in whatever you're doing. You have to invest in something to get back. You were talking about the flow of energy. It's like the same thing.
It's like a snowball effect, right? So what I could spend in my first month was like boosting a post for $200. And then when I took some of that $15, put it back and invested a little bit more. And so actually, like, I have an annual event for authors, and it's specifically for, I call them intermediate and advanced level authors, and you have to have published a certain number of books to attend, because most events that already existed in the author world at the time were beginners could come. And while I'm so glad that there's a space for them, and I use those spaces as well, and I really appreciated them, the fact is, if I were to be like, yes, I spend this much on a new release, that's going to scare the heck out of someone who has never published a single book. But of course, the idea is that you would never do that. You would never, and this is what I tell people, and I think people still don't believe me, but it's so true. Even if you told me I have a trust fund sitting there with a bunch of money and I don't need it, here's my first book, should I spend it? I'm going to say no. Because you need to actually learn how to do ads. You need to learn your voice as an author. You need to learn what sort of in the maybe product world or coaching world might be called like product market fit or other words like that. But yeah, there's no, like, money is not the button. Being able to do Facebook ads is the button.
Interesting. Very useful. Thank you for sharing that. Super useful. Wow. All right. It's such an interesting thing that you're doing. It's such an interesting business. So you're writing and you're also doing coaching and working with people to help them succeed. And you're giving a lot of wonderful things out there in the world and all of it. And at the same time, trying to deal with your own issues. You're working through the chronic depression and the healing process that you're always maybe will be ongoing forever. I don't know, but I think it's wonderful what you're doing and how much you're giving to the world and what you're putting out there. And I'm really glad to have had this time with you to dig into your brain a little bit. It is really fun in there.
It's a little wild in here. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking to you and you're really insightful. And I love that you can pull things out that I hadn't even thought of about my own life. So yeah.
I have to ask you one more question before
Okay.
we finally end. And that is, what are the biggest lessons that you've learned in this life?
Oh gosh. Okay, here's this one I'm going to tell. So I always had this thing, I told you this already, about the story, The Princess and the Pea. It's like my mom read it to me early. And in that version of the story, the princess became the queen, but it was also confusing. Like, why does her being so picky about noticing a pea underneath mattresses qualify her to be a princess? Isn't she just picky? Isn't she just someone who can't be pleased? And in a way, that's what we're saying is like the princess or the queen. And it always stuck with me. And then when I was going through my never ending sleeping time, I would just notice little depictions of her on a stack of mattresses. And I'm like, yep, that's me, just chained to the bed. I'm only depicted in bed because that's where I am. And I just always felt this affinity for it, but I also felt repelled. I was like, I don't want to be someone who would notice a pea. And then I mentioned to you that I had this like psychic reading done. And I never met the woman. I never even saw her face to face over a Zoom or anything. I just asked her my questions. And then a couple weeks later, she sent back this recording she had done. And she was like, what comes to mind? The Princess and the Pea. And she says, but she describes it in a way that I hadn't seen it described before. She says, in the story, actually in her version of the story, there was an innkeeper, which fairy tales have a lot of different versions, of course. And in her version, she told the innkeeper there was something wrong with the bed, that there was a pea, and he did not believe her. And she said, no, it's definitely there. And he still didn't believe her. And then when it was finally revealed, it was like, you were telling the truth all along. And she was using it as this. So it's like you have sensed that there's a problem. And now you're not actually going to let it go. You're not going to let yourself be gaslit into believing it's not there when you feel it. And so I think my lesson is to embody that. And it is to embrace this idea that I wasn't maybe put here to be the person who is, yeah, anything goes. Like, I'm super chill about any way that we're going to do this, because that's what I would love to be. That to me sounds like a great way to exist. But I wasn't put here for that. I was put here to notice the pea. And sometimes the P is, hey, I don't feel well. And sometimes the P is, hey, there's no books for women who've experienced this. And I just feel compelled to be like, no, look, guys, it's here. And some people will tell me it's not there. You're imagining things. And I'm like, nope, we're still going to talk about it. That's my lesson.
Revealing the P.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a book title.
It might be about a different topic.
Yeah, that's your personal development book.
Yeah.
Okay. And what about your biggest blessing?
Oh, I will tell you this. My real name is not Skye Warren. That's my pen name. And my husband
I was going to ask you that, but then I thought, we'll let the mystery stand.
I actually am more comfortable with my author name just because I go to events and people call me that. Whereas at home, I'm just called Kate. And so, yeah, so my husband once asked me, who are you really? Are you the pen name persona or are you? And he said in Batman, he calls himself Batman. So that's how he knows that's who he really is. And I said, I actually don't know which one I am. I told him. And I just looked over at my son and I said, which one do you think I am? And he said, your identity, like he asked me to explain it. I'm like, he's like, your identity? He said, dog mom. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. That is me. It's not even the writer or the computer scientist or whatever. It's just me having dogs. They're such a blessing. I can never get enough.
All right. Beautiful. Beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much, Skye, or whatever your name really is.
Just call me Batman.
We'll call you Dog Mom, Batman.
Yeah, that works.
Sugar glider lady.
Yes, I have.
All right. Whatever you want to call yourself doesn't matter to me. I will call you beautiful. I love talking to you. And thank you so much for being here today.
See, bye.